Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on exploring your alternatives using decision trees. My name is Kevin Ordonez. I am a co-founder of .org Community, as well as co-author of 2 books on disruption and organizational transformations. I'm also president of orgSource, a consulting agency dedicated to positioning associations for success. Now on to our webinar. So today's webinar is on exploring your alternatives to decision trees. So Sharon Rice is our managing director for strategy at orgSource, and she will show us to anticipate multiple possible scenarios for how things might unfold over time using a decision tree. And welcome, Sharon.
Hi, thank you, everybody. So I'm really excited to talk to you about using decision trees today. And one of the things that I like about them is that we're going to have to use math. And so as we go through this process, let's see if I can get my screen, we're going to talk about what a decision tree is and how a decision tree can be created. And I'm going to give you 3 examples, and these examples are going to progress in terms of complexity. We'll start with an example about should I get out of a bed this morning, which I think is extremely relevant for a lot of us these days. The second example, should we plan on having our fall conference? And then the third example is how we should handle dues billing over the next 3 months. So we're using examples here that are relevant to the moment that we're living right now, but decision trees can be used in all sorts of different settings. And as we look at our questions and some of the questions that you submitted, I'll share some examples also about how decision trees can be used in times that we're not having to make such critical decisions as these. All right, so let's start with talking about what a decision tree is. So decision trees are a form of kind of a framework of thinking for programmers that are working with programming machine logic and artificial intelligence. And so they're really at their base, they're scientific based, complex algorithmic models. But we have kind of co-opted these for business management and simplified certainly the process. And so when we talk about decision trees in a business context, what we're really talking about is a graphic framework that we still use math, we still use estimates and probabilities, but hopefully then will guide this framework and this structured thinking guide us to making the best possible decision. So decision trees also will predict likely outcomes and net gains from various alternatives. So one of the things that's key to a decision tree is that there have to be alternatives. You have to be deciding between alternatives. They're built to begin with from tables or matrices. We're going to use tables today, and then we illustrate them in a branch format. In reality, they're actually pretty easy to use and master. And so we're going to go through it again, as I said, 3 times, so you can kind of pick up the logic. And you know, they're not only good at but they're only as good as our estimates that we use in the calculation. So to a certain extent, what we're doing is forecasting a result as we're estimating. We're talking about probabilities, and therefore they're improved with vetting. And we're going to talk about this in the question section as well. All right, so how is a decision tree created? We're going to start with a very simple example, and the question that we're dealing with here is, what should I do today? So I have a table that I've set up here with my alternatives. So you can see in the columns, I have the choice. I can stay in bed, I can shop online, or I could actually work. Those are my alternatives. And so in this example, we're going to start with the cost of the alternative. So it really costs me nothing to stay in bed. If I stay in bed, I'm not spending any money. We could talk about overhead costs, like what it costs, you know, my mortgage or whatnot. But I'm going to simplify that and say it's not going to cost me anything to stay in bed. If I shop online, let's say that I would spend generally about $250. So that's a cost of that activity. I have to have money and spend money to be able to shop online. And if I were going to work, or if I was typically working kind of pre-COVID, I might go out to lunch and get some coffee and do some other things. So I'm saying the cost of working, I might have to pay for parking, is about $25. So now we're going to look at the revenue that we get from these alternatives. So a revenue from staying in bed is 0. I don't make any money. It doesn't cost me anything, but I don't make any money. Revenue related to shopping online is also 0. I'm not making money while I'm shopping online. But if I go to work, let's say I make roughly $1,000. That should be 1,000, not $1. The probability of me making money if I stay in bed is 0. there's 0% chance that I'm going to make any money. The probability of making money if I shop online is 0% chance I'm going to make money shopping online. But the probability that I'm going to make money if I go to work is 100%. And we represent these probabilities in terms of, they should all equal 1. So you see in the relationship, when we talk about probability of making versus losing money, if I have 0% of making money, then I have to have 100%, or 1 is the factor we're looking at here, in losing money. The same is true with online shopping. If I'm not going to make money, there's 0% I'm going to make money, then there's 100% that I'm going to lose money. Whereas if I go to work, we see the inverse relationship, 100% chance that I'm going to make money, but 0% chance that I'm going to lose money. So then we calculate net gain. If I stay in bed, I don't gain anything. If I look at my income over expense, my net gain is 0. If I spend time shopping online, I'm going to lose $250 because I have an expense of $250 and no revenue to offset that. But if I go to work, I'm going to be able to, or I'm projecting anyway, that I would make $975 because while I'm making $1,000 in revenue, I spent $25 to support me during the day. And so that obviously equals 975. So this is a matrix that would point a direction in terms of a decision. And then typically what we do is we'll illustrate this in a more graphic model. So here I've chosen, and there's lots of different ways to illustrate this. Sometimes we see it in more of a flow chart format. So it just depends on what your sensibility is. I like this one. What should I do today? I dropped off, stay in bed. I decided that alternative really wasn't worth taking the time to graph. So here my alternatives are work or shop online. And you can see the branches here. You follow it across. So if I work, I will spend $25, I'll make $1,000, my net gain is $975. If I shop online, my expense is $250, my income is 0, my net gain is a loss of $250. Therefore, the best alternative for me is to work. So that's a very simple example of how we use these concepts. Now, what I'd like to do is, and I'm going to go through this next one a little bit more slowly and show you how we would use it with a real life example of something that maybe some of you are experiencing today. Should we hold our fall conference? We're getting this question a lot. Should we hold our fall conference? So again, we set up the table like we did before. We're looking at our alternatives, and here are the alternatives that we're exploring. We can hold the conference as planned. We can cancel the conference, or we could go virtual. Now, there may be other alternatives that you would want to explore, and so you can look at a number of alternatives here. They get harder to graph the more alternatives you look at. So sometimes it can be a kind of a process of elimination if you're going to do it in a graph. But when you're doing a table, it's a lot easier than to go ahead and explore multiple alternatives. But we're going to focus on these 3, I think, most common alternatives. So I set up the factors that I'm looking at, where you see in the column that starts with alternatives. I set these factors up similar to the example we just gave. So I want to know the cost of what the option is. So what is it going to cost me? In this case, I'm looking at sales. And so I'm going to be a little bit more detailed, let's say, when I do my estimates. So I'm going to look at what high registration would look like and what low registration might look like. Now I'm estimating these. So because I don't really have an example that I can lean on, I haven't canceled a conference before, I don't really know, we haven't, let's say, been in the situation even to consider what we should do with our conference. I don't have good data to work with here, so I'm going to have to estimate this data. Then we move into our probability, the probability that we'll have high registration and the probability that we'll have low registration. I'm looking at the outcome. So if I've estimated my high registration, I've assigned a probability factor to it. Now I'm going to say, what's the outcome of that? And we'll talk about this formula in a minute. And I'm going to do the same thing on low registration. And then finally, we'll calculate net gain, and net gain is always income over expense. Okay, so let's look at the first column. If we hold the conference as planned, in my example, I'm saying it costs $1.2 million for us to hold the conference. That's a no. I know what it costs me year over year to be able to hold a conference. I've got a budget for the conference, and because this is essentially status quo, meaning I'm just going to proceed with my plans as budgeted, I can say with some confidence that if I proceeded as planned, it would cost me around $1.2 million. High registration for me, in my estimate, would be the same registration that I had last year, or what I budgeted for. And so I'm just saying, I'm setting that mark, and I'm saying in best case scenario, by the time we get to the fall, let's say that we had a vaccine, whatever is holding us back from being able to hold our fall conference or be confident that we're going to be able to hold our fall conference is no longer a factor. So my high registration is what I budgeted, and that budget was based somewhat on last year in my scenario. Low registration, you can see, is essentially that I get only about 1/3 of my registration revenue. So I have about 1/3 of the attendees. If that 1.5 million represents, let's say, 1,500 attendees, then in this case, I might be only looking at 500 attendees at the conference. So I set a high mark and I set a low mark. So now I have to assign a probability to both. And the important thing to remember here is that probability, when we add up those two figures, they have to equal 1. Because whether we're hitting high or low mark, it's going to end up as 100%. We think about it as 100%. So what's the probability that I'm going to, again, this is an estimate or a forecast, what's the probability that I'll get my high registration? Well, when I look at all the data out there, the epidemiology of what we're dealing with, the recession and everything else that I'm taking into consideration, of course, I don't know exactly how things are going to work out. But what I'm saying is, boy, I'm not very confident in this 1.5 number. I almost see no way that this is going to happen. So I'm going to give it a probability of 0.2. Okay, there's only 20% chance in my mind that we would hit that 1.5. That means that the probability of low registration has to be 0.8, because again, it has to equal 1. So I believe in that 500,000 figure much more strongly than I believe in the 1.5 figure. So now let's look at the outcomes. So the formula essentially is that we take the probability, in this case 0.2, multiply that by what our high registration estimate is, and you can see that we come up with $300,000 here. Okay, same thing with the low registration. We take the probability that we assign, 0.8%, 0.8, I'm sorry, not 80%, and we multiply that by the 500,000 number, that's our projected low registration, and we come up with 400,000. So then to calculate the net gain, we're going to take the 300 plus the 400,000, we subtract our cost at 1.2, and we come up with a net gain, a net loss, I should say, it's a gain, a negative number, of 500,000. So what we're doing in assigning the probability to the high and the low, and then adding those together, is that what we feel like is we're getting closer to reality. You might think about it as splitting the difference in some way. If we take the outcome of high registration and the outcome of low registration, in some ways what we're doing is, as you can see, kind of meeting in the middle. We're adding those two figures up. We're saying that is what our likely registration would be based on these probabilities. And then you can see that this option results in a net loss of 500,000. Now let's look at the cancel, and cancel or do nothing, and we're going to use this with our dues example as well. This is the easy thing to do. Let's say if we cancel it, we've got 450,000 in attrition fees and sunk costs and contract obligations that we have. So you all, if you're battling this right now, you already know, I'm sure, what your cost is going to be if you cancel your meeting from an obligation perspective. And I'm not putting staff time in here, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about overhead and whether to put overhead or not to put overhead in, but just know that I'm not putting overhead here. So we don't have registration, so there's no reason to go through the exercise of looking at high registration and low registration. We're not looking at probabilities, and the outcome we just know is a loss of $450. So our third option is to go virtual. And going virtual, we're going to estimate a cost of $250 on this. And now that I'm looking at this, I'm going to say, all right, we've got some revenue in here. If we're virtual, we probably have attrition fees too, which I apologize. When I get this back to you, I'm going to change this. And this is a good example here about why we vet these things. Because if I go virtual right now, and I was planning for my annual meeting, I probably have attrition costs in here as well. So that's something I need to look at. But I also will still be using speakers. So if I paid for my speakers, for example, I still have that expense that'll be a part of this as well. So pretending that I didn't make that mistake, if we go forward, the high registration is 550 from my estimate. The low registration would be 150. Now, when I calculated these, I was calculating a much lower cost for registration. So the price of registration is going to be lower than an in-person meeting. And I ran numbers. So this wasn't just pulling these numbers out of the air. I'm taking a look at what do I think I can cost, what's price for this, what's the market pricing for this. So I did some work behind that. And then I go to my probabilities. 0.6% I'm assigning to the high registration cost. The probability for the low registration cost is about 0.4%. And then we use the same formula again to calculate it. So 0.6% of 550 is 330. 0.4% of 150 is 660. And then we add those figures together, subtract our costs, and we come up with 140K gain in this example. Now, what I can tell you again on the fly, going back and saying, well, if I had roughly 300,000 in attrition fees because I'm still not using my hotel, you can see that I would have a net loss here as well. Okay. So again, the importance of vetting these numbers with other people in other departments to help you to perfect those numbers. But again, if I hadn't made that mistake in my calculations, I would look at this and I say, should we hold a conference? And here I went ahead and I looked at each of the three options, looked at the expense, the income, the high and the low income, the net gain, and then the decision was to go virtual on this. And if we added 300,000 back into this, what we would see is that canceling the meeting and holding the meeting virtually at this point would probably net out about the same. And then we would have to start looking at the non-financial factors that are involved in this. And I'm going to show you this in a little bit when we go through questions. All right, I hope you're following along with me. We're going to go through one more example on this. And this one is, how should we handle dues billing during the next 3 months? So my alternative is that we just keep going as we always have gone. So as planned, we'll do our dues billing. My second alternative is that we suspend billing for 3 months, so we don't even bother billing people for 3 months. And of course, we're letting them know that and why we're making that decision. Or we extend grace, what I call extend grace. And extending grace simply means we're going to bill you, but if you can't pay during this period, it's okay, we're not going to terminate your membership. So we're extending grace. So when we look at the cost of these options, and here I want to talk about overhead. We have a choice where we can go ahead and assign overhead to these. A lot of times associations don't go to that level of detail when they're doing their financials, so they don't really necessarily know how much overhead is assigned to each program, like the membership program or dues billing program. So here, when I was calculating it, in my head, I'm going, well, overhead costs we're going to have to maintain anyway. I don't have a whole lot of direct expense related to membership dues except for processing fees. So we think about, there may be some staff direct expense that you have some staff that are working on this and you can articulate how many hours they're doing it, but we know for sure we have credit card fees and there may be other types of bank fees. So that's how I kind of calculated that and looked at it. High receipts as planned. A normal year in this period, I might collect 300,000. So I'm going to say that my low receipts would be half. So retention at that point would be 50% of what it normally would be. I assign my probabilities. So I think right off the bat, I'm probably going to be closer to the 150 than I am to the 300, but it's pretty close. I'm not 100% sure. And then I go ahead and I calculate the outcome of high receipts and low receipts. and then to calculate net gain, add those together, subtract my expense, and then I come up with $201,000 as the net gain there. If I suspend billing, and I'm hearing, I'll just say, a lot of people talking about suspending billing right now, and this is an option you really have to carefully consider, and I would use extreme caution with this, because you are going to lose money if you suspend billing, and may be difficult to get back on track. It certainly is going to impact your cash flow. So let's look at the alternative of extending grace. And that, again, extending grace means we're still going to bill, but we're going to let you know that while we're sending you a bill, if you can't pay, we're not going to terminate you for a period of time. We understand. But what we're hoping is that everybody who can pay will, and then will, and if I were doing the messaging, I'd also say, help support the association, but help support your fellow professionals who may not be able to pay right now or don't have the time to. So we're going to still have some bank fees with this. I think high receipts on this might be $250. So again, lower, because we're telling them essentially we're not going to terminate them. The low receipts are a little bit lower. This is a 50-50 proposition to me. So 50% chance that we'll be able to do it, 50 we won't. When I look at the outcome then, applying the probability to the high and the low receipts, and then calculating net gain, here I'm making a little bit more money, $217,000 instead of the 201 of going as planned. Now, this should be somewhat surprising, because we would think that if we continue as planned, without that extra messaging that says we're not going to terminate you, that we probably in our heads would think, yeah, well, then we should be making more money. But in reality, again, we have a reduction of bank fees and a reduction of high and low receipts, but it's the probability that we're assigning to this. We have a shot, we think, with this messaging of bumping up those the receipts. So on the high end, we get closer to meeting that high end goal based on the probabilities that we've assigned. And you can see this is what the decision tree looks like for that example. All right, so a couple of questions that you asked ahead of time. Decision trees are quantitative models. What about the qualitative? You absolutely can use the decision tree format to document qualitative factors. So should we hold our fall conference here, what you'll notice is where I put income and expense in my quantitative model, I put kind of pluses and minuses here for holding it. And then the net gain column, well, net gain would be preserving brand if we hold it, damaging brand if we cancel it, or enhancing brand if we go virtual, because we're giving our audience something that they need and they want, and we're being nimble in responding to the environment. So we come to the same decision of going virtual in this example. Okay, what was your greatest success using a decision tree? It actually happened in 2007, prior to the last recession. We were considering a dues increase. This was highly unpopular. Our chapter leaders were telling us don't do it. Our volunteer leaders were telling us don't do it. When we looked at it, we said we have no choice. We haven't raised dues in a really long time. So we did the decision tree model, and the model said raise dues. We increased our dues. The recession hit. And the interesting thing is, while our retention did go down, the impact of the dues increase kind of saved the day. So the dues increase netted more income than the loss of retention. And eventually, then we were able to build our retention rate back up. So that was, I think, the most interesting example that I had of looking at a decision tree. After securing buy-in, how do you enforce cross-departmental decision trees? I've given you very simple examples here, but I would use decision-making format as a collaboration tool. I'd start right off the bat, either developing the model across departments or consulting with other departments after the initial model was developed to vet and refine so that everybody sees the thinking and gets online. On board. Are decision trees effective in communicating with volunteer leaders and the board? I really think that they are. I think they make a nice summary model to show the board when you're coming with a recommendation. They demonstrate some diligent thinking that went into the recommendation. It's kind of like showing your math, showing your work. They can follow along with it. I think it also helps focus the discussion and avoid those meandering discussions about what if, or what if we did this, or how do we do that, because it points a direction. And then it also, I think, creates buy-in for the decision. So that's a quick summary of decision trees. I'm glad to answer any more questions that you might submit. We will put those online. I also want to call your attention to the fact that we do have a fantastic resource online right now. It's modeling the impact of COVID-19 and the recession on your association, or on associations in general, I should say. It's a 12-minute video, and it shows the result of a meeting we had with 10 CEOs where we worked through the short, mid, and long-term impact that we felt that COVID-19 crisis and the recession was going to have on associations. And so it's a 12-minute video. I think it's well worth your while. And of course, if you have any questions afterwards, you can give us a call and we'd be glad to talk to you about it. And that is our 30 minutes today.
Well, thank you, Sharon. That was wonderful. I do have one question here in the chat going back to your example about membership. Can you clarify if that is anniversary join date or a calendar year? How would that particular example apply?
That example, it could apply to either anniversary or calendar. I was thinking anniversary when I did it, but it could be either one.
Certainly. Okay, well, we are at the top of the hour. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you so much for joining us. We will get out this replay, a copy of the slides, and we'll also link to this YouTube video in our thank you for attending email. So stay tuned for that. We also have our webinar next week if you're interested on how to be a digital leader in this time. So thanks again to Sharon for presenting and to all of you for participating. We'll see you next week. Have a great day.